The last time I hosted this program, my last show, in fact, was on June 24th, 2011. Now, on that program, I interviewed Senator Hugh Segal about his push to have a national referendum on whether to abolish the Senate. I also spoke to Don Morgan, then the Justice Minister of Saskatchewan. He was advocating for Senate reform, specifically for an elected Senate. And I told him about a Saskatchewan hamlet named Senate in honor of the upper chamber. And I reminded him Senate Saskatchewan was no more, plowed under by bulldozers in 1994. So I asked him what would go through his mind the next time he drove by a town that is now gone.
I'm going to wonder whether the Senate in Ottawa will end up in a landfill the same way as Senate Saskatchewan did. I certainly hope that's not the case. We're willing to give it a chance.
Well, it doesn't look like Saskatchewan is ready to give the Senate a chance anymore. The Saskatchewan Party members voted 86% in favor of abolishing the Senate in a mail-in referendum. But a lot of provinces and many constitutional experts say abolition is a non-starter. Joining me now is the Premier of Saskatchewan, Brad Wall. Welcome back to the House.
Hi, Kathleen. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. So I'm curious to know why you and your party have both given up on pushing for an elected Senate.
Well, I think the clip from Don was very accurate at the time. We had passed legislation to allow for elected senators from this province, dependent, of course, on the Prime Minister that would appoint them. That's not always been the case in Canada, where Alberta has been electing senators for some time, and Prime Ministers, up until Prime Minister Harper, certainly were not appointing them, even the elected nominees. But having said all of that, we were prepared to give it a chance, as Don said, and our position has evolved. Mine personally has. I think members of our party, I think we were all once very hopeful that a Triple E Senate was possible, and the Triple E part of this is important because one of those E's is an equal Senate, which means, of course, that every province would have equal representation in the Senate in an effective an elected Senate. And, unfortunately, I think we've just come to the view that kind of reform is simply never going to happen, which begs the question then, is the status quo acceptable at $100 million a year, or frankly at any price tag? And I think the majority of Saskatchewan people in a significant way think that the status quo is not the best option. They also think, by the way, the Senate's not the most important issue, and so do I, facing the country or our province, but that if reform's not possible, and if abolition is marginally more possible, then maybe that should be the pursuit of Canadians over the next while.
Yeah, when I talked to Don Morgan a couple of years ago, part of his big frustration was with all these appointments. And Stephen Harper, as you know, has appointed more than 50 senators after promising not to appoint any senators. So to what extent is your frustration, frankly, a result of the Prime Minister's failure to keep his promise?
Well, I think the Prime Minister told all of the provinces, look, if you want to elect senators, if you will have elections, I will appoint the elected senator. But it was basically left to us to have that legislation in place. We are, as we mentioned off the top, we have that legislation on the books. I expect it will be repealed, but we do now. The challenge for us was a debate with the federal government over who would pay. We thought the federal government should pay for federal elections, and it's about $1 million, and we'd rather build some highways or do something else with it. So there was a bit of a discussion there. But to be fair to the federal government, they were saying, look, if you want to elect senators, the Prime Minister said, I will appoint them. And he has. And here's, by the way, the problem with that, and I referenced it earlier, is that if there's, if the Prime Minister changes down the road in the years ahead, and there's no assurance that the then Prime Minister would appoint elected nominees from the provinces, then, sort of what's the point? And underscoring all of this is the fact that this is just only one of the three E's that's necessary for meaningful reform. It's just not, unfortunately, I just don't think it's going to happen. And the good news is that we have a very decentralized federation, and so on a de facto basis, you have significant check and balances in the provincial capitals. I would just put it out there rhetorically, who is the clarion voice for the interests of the people of Prince Edward Island? Is it Robert Giz, or was it Senator Duffy or any of the other senators from that province? Clearly, I think it's the provincial capitals that provide that now in the Federation.
But I would say this, you could have made that point 2 years ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, number one. Number two, you suggest that the provinces should have taken the lead on this by pursuing legislation to allow for elections. Well, those very same provinces, the vast majority of them, have no interest in abolition.
Well, that's not quite true, Kathleen, because up until very recently, and I'm hopeful that their position could change back. We had former Premier McGuinty of Ontario in favor of abolition.
But he's gone.
Well, but I mean that was the position. Same party in power, and I understand Premier Wynne now has a different position. But to the extent that Ontario once favored abolition, there's a chance it would again. And if you need 7 provinces representing 50%, it's more likely, although still very, very difficult, I acknowledge, and I always have, it's slightly more possible that we could just have done with this particular institution than we could reform it.
But we're not even sure the 750 formula applies, which is one of the reasons why the federal government, after, frankly, some urging by the Liberals a number of years ago to put a reference before the Supreme Court, now has done that. And they will be asked to rule on a number of things, term limits, elections, as well as what the constitutional formula actually would be for abolition.
Right, and 750 is one of the options. I know our justice officials are thinking that that's likely where the Supreme Court will come down, but we'll know probably by the end of November what that decision is, and then provinces can act. Either way, it's reasonable that provinces may want to offer a free vote to their members, have a bit of a debate, with the proviso that, look, this is not the most important issue facing Saskatchewan or Canada, but it is an issue. And, that's an option that provinces have. It's one that we're going to look at very carefully in the light of recent discussions that we've had here in Saskatchewan. At the Premier's meeting coming up here in just a couple weeks, healthcare is a priority, the economy is. Sure, there's going to be discussions about national institutions like the Senate. We'll make our case, but, it's nothing that anyone's obsessed about, I don't think.
Not obsessed, but you've come to a conclusion, clearly, and I'm wondering why you just wouldn't have waited for the Supreme Court to offer its opinion.
Well, whether the Supreme Court says you need 7 provinces with 50% or all the provinces, my job is to try to gauge and represent the interests and the views of the people of Saskatchewan. And their views don't change in either of those scenarios. We've now heard strongly, not just from our party members, but also from the people in Saskatchewan who there's some recent polling and anecdotal evidence that, look, it's time for us to move on.
Are you one of those politicians who actually believes in polls?
Well, they've not been completely inaccurate in our case.
But I guess what I would wonder is why not just have a referendum, as Senator Hugh Segal has been saying for years. Why not advocate for a national referendum for the entire country and then see if those provinces who are currently not on board might come on board?
Well, a national referendum is not something we would oppose, first of all, but you could also have each provincial capital saying, look, in the fall we're going to have a resolution to debate, and members are going to be allowed a free vote to vote the views of their constituents. Because whatever the formula, whether it's all of the provinces or 7 of them representing 50, you're going to need constitutional resolutions or resolutions in the provincial capitals, in the legislature. So, there's a number of different options for governments to look at if we're going to gauge the interests of Canadians in continuing with the institution. It's 2013. We have a completely unelected, except for one, basically a completely unelected, anachronistic institution that is not accountable to the public, regardless of who is appointing the senators. And I just think people are wondering if that makes sense in this day and age in this country.
Finally, I am interested to know from you, when you heard about that $90,000 check for Mike Duffy from the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, and more recently when you heard about the affidavit alleging that 2 other members of the PMO, along with the head of the Conservative Fund, Senator Irving Gerstein, were willing to bail out Mike Duffy until the price got too high. What did you think?
Well, I just don't get it. And I don't understand why that would be the case, because, the government of Canada is not going to turn on the status of a senator, Mike Duffy or anyone else. But I haven't I don't know the answer to that question because I haven't posted or gotten into any kind of an in-depth discussion on it. But I was just confused as to why that would be such a priority.
And finally, can I ask you, would you fire people in your office if they offered to bail someone out who'd inappropriately claimed money from taxpayers?
That it just wouldn't happen in our office, I guess. If it did, there would be real and quick consequences.
Is that a yes?
Well, yeah. I mean, the most meaningful consequence is someone's employment. But we're going to work very hard to make sure that never happens in the office.
Premier Brad Wall, thanks very much for talking with me.
Thanks very much.
Brad Wall is the Premier of Saskatchewan.